All right, so picture this. You're in Berlin, it's 1961, life is, bustling all around you. And then boom, practically overnight, this wall just slices right through the heart of the city. Families are split apart, streets are cut off. What was once one unified community becomes this stark symbol of division. Crazy, right?
Yeah, it's wild. This is the Berlin Wall we're talking about, of course.
Yeah.
And it's a story that I think, well, it really captures how these global events can impact everyday people.
Absolutely. And you know what? You've given us a ton of material on the Berlin Wall, so let's just dive right in.
Okay, sounds good. Where should we start?
Well, I think we should probably start with, why the wall went up in the first place. Like, what led to that?
Right, okay. So the Berlin Wall, it's more than just a wall.
Right.
It's this tangible representation of this huge ideological battle.
The Cold War. The Cold War. Okay.
Yeah.
So, for those of us who, weren't around back then, can you give us like a Cold War 101? Like, what was that all about?
Okay, so Cold War 101. Basically, it was this clash of superpowers, the US, the Soviet Union. They both emerged from World War II as these dominant forces, each with their own system, right? Political,
Yeah.
economic.
Okay, so like capitalism versus communism.
Exactly.
Okay.
And they just couldn't agree, right? Like
Yeah.
how the world should be run. And all that tension, well, it fueled this rivalry, decades long, the Cold War.
And Germany, especially Berlin, became like the center of all this, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, can you imagine a city where you could walk from a free democracy into a communist state, just like a few steps?
That's wild.
Yeah, it was a divided city within a divided country. West Berlin, aligned with the US, became like this beacon of freedom, opportunity.
Right.
But then, just a few blocks away, East Berlin, under Soviet control, was tightly controlled, limited freedoms.
So that's why they built the wall, right? To keep people in the east.
Exactly. They called it the anti-fascist protection rampart. Can you believe that?
Mhm.
But in reality, it was all about stopping the brain drain. All those skilled workers, intellectuals, fleeing to the West for a better life.
And what was life actually like for those living in East Berlin? Like, I'm curious about the day-to-day experience.
Yeah. I mean, it was pretty bleak. Constant surveillance.
Right.
Like the Stasi, the East German secret police.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I've heard of them.
They were everywhere. Neighbors informing on neighbors, mail being opened, phone calls tapped. It was, about controlling every aspect of life.
That's heavy. So, like, people couldn't even speak their minds.
Not really. But you know what's amazing? Despite all of that, there were these pockets of resistance. People expressed themselves through art, music, literature, often like coded messages challenging the regime.
That's incredible. And what about those escapes? The ones you hear about, people tunneling under the wall or hiding in cars?
Oh, those were incredible, weren't they? People were desperate. I mean, they'd do anything to reach the West. Tunnels, hidden compartments in cars, even hot air balloons.
It's crazy how far people would go for freedom. And not just freedom, right? I mean, there was huge economic disparity, too.
Yeah, I mean, the West had like a booming consumer society. The East, they had shortages of basic goods. So yeah, crossing the wall wasn't just about freedom, it was about opportunity.
But, the East German government, they had a term for those who left right, brain drain. Like, they were losing their most talented people.
Exactly. It's, one of those classic unintended consequences, right?
Okay.
They build a wall to stop people from leaving, but all it does is show just how much their system wasn't working.
It's like the wall itself was this giant admission of failure.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
And those failures, they became impossible to ignore, especially as the Soviet system itself began to weaken. We have to talk about Gorbachev and his reforms.
Oh, right. Because the Berlin Wall didn't come down, like, out of nowhere, right? It was part of this bigger shift happening in Eastern Europe.
Exactly. So by the 1980s, the Soviet Union, it's facing economic stagnation, social unrest. Gorbachev, he comes to power in 1985 and realizes, something has to change.
Okay, and what does he do?
He introduces these reforms, perestroika and glasnost. Perestroika was about restructuring the economy, and glasnost was more openness and transparency in the government.
And I'm guessing those reforms, they didn't exactly go as planned.
Well, his goal was to, revitalize the Soviet system, not to, dismantle it. But what he ended up doing was unleashing all these unintended consequences. Loosening the grip of communist control fueled all these democratic movements across Eastern Europe.
So like a domino effect.
Yeah, exactly. It was like a dam breaking, and there was no stopping it.
So we've got a weakening Soviet Union, these pro-democracy movements gaining steam, and in the middle of it all, there's the Berlin Wall. I mean, it seemed permanent, right? Unchangeable.
Yeah. But the ground, it was shifting beneath it, and things were about to get really interesting. especially in Berlin.
And that brings us to 1989, right? The year the wall came down.
Right. And, the story of how it actually happened, well, it's almost too strange to be true.
Okay, I'm all ears.
So picture this. November 9th, 1989, this guy, Günter Schabowski, he's like the party boss of East Berlin. And he's supposed to announce these, like, slightly relaxed travel regulations.
Yeah.
Nothing major. But then during this live TV press conference,
Wait, live TV?
he fumbles his words. And he ends up creating this impression that, well, that East Germans could just cross into West Berlin right then, like right that second.
Whoa, hold on. So he just accidentally announced this huge change, like on live TV.
It was total chaos.
Ah.
Nobody knew if it was real, if it was a mistake. But the thing is, people, they heard it. They heard the possibility of freedom, and they weren't going to let that go.
So what happened? Did they just like rush the wall?
Thousands of them did. They rushed to the border crossings, demanding to be let through. The crowd, they kept swelling.
And what about the guards? What did they do?
The guards, they were totally unprepared. They had no orders, no idea what to do. And faced with all those people, I mean, what could they do? They eventually gave in. And then, it was just this wave of pure euphoria. People hugging, crying, laughing. That wall, the one that had divided them for so long, it was finally coming down. People were chipping away at it with hammers and chisels.
It must have been just incredible to witness. I mean, those images of people flooding through the checkpoints, hammering at the wall, celebrating, they became like these iconic symbols, of freedom over oppression.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, the fall of the Berlin Wall, it wasn't just about Berlin or even Germany, It sent these shockwaves around the world. It was the beginning of the end for the whole Cold War.
And like within a year, Germany was reunified. The Soviet Union collapsed. It's crazy how one event, like triggered by this almost accidental announcement, could change so much.
It really does show you, how much people were yearning for change, for freedom. And that wall, it was like this symbol of all that pent-up desire. And once it fell, well, everything changed.
We talked earlier about how the Berlin Wall, it was more than just a physical barrier. So when it fell, what other walls came down with it?
Well, on a symbolic level, I mean, it was like the whole Iron Curtain was being dismantled, that ideological barrier that had divided Europe for decades. It felt like a real shift towards, well, like openness, cooperation, especially in Europe.
So not just the reunification of Germany, but a broader sense of unity across the continent.
Exactly, yeah. It paved the way for the European Union to expand, right? Former communist countries joining, trade barriers came down, people could travel more easily, there was more cultural exchange.
So decades of being divided, and then boom, it starts to dissolve. Amazing.
Yeah. And it happened so fast, too, which is what's so remarkable, right? It just shows you how much people wanted change. They've been wanting it for years.
And that brings us to the legacy of the Berlin Wall. Even today, it's such a powerful symbol, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's a powerful reminder, of the cost of division and oppression. It's a memorial to those who lost their lives trying to cross it. And it shows the resilience of the human spirit in the face of tyranny.
And the power of hope, right? Like, even when things seem impossible, change can happen. It makes you think about what walls we still have today. What divisions, barriers, things that seem impossible to change.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, are there metaphorical walls that divide us based on ideology, nationality, social status? Are there systems that limit our freedom or, prevent us from reaching our potential?
And I guess the even bigger question is, well, what can we learn from those who brought down the Berlin Wall? How can we, use those lessons for the challenges we face today?
Well, studying history isn't just about the past, right? It's about learning from it, finding inspiration for the present.
So what are some of the key takeaways? What really stands out to you about the Berlin Wall's fall?
Well, to me, it shows the power of individual action. It wasn't just world leaders or politicians who brought it down. It was everyday people. People who refused to accept things the way they were, who dared to imagine something better.
It's like a reminder that we all have a role to play, right, in shaping the world.
Exactly. Whether it's speaking out against injustice or, advocating for change, or even just, showing compassion. Every action can help build a more just world.
Yeah, and it's easy to get caught up in like the big picture stuff, right? The politics, the global implications. But with the Berlin Wall, you really can't forget about the human side of it all.
Oh, absolutely. It's those individual stories that, they really make history come alive. Think about it, like families separated for, decades, individuals risking everything for a chance at freedom. communities coming together to demand change. Those are the stories that, well, they help us understand what the Berlin Wall really meant to those who lived through it.
Yeah. And we've got some like really incredible firsthand accounts in this material. One that like, I don't know, really stuck with me. It was about this group of East Berliners and they like dug this tunnel right under the wall to help their loved ones escape. I mean, can you imagine the risk? If they got caught, that was it.
It's amazing, right? It shows how strong human connection is.
Yeah.
What people will do for each other. And it wasn't just about escaping physically. I mean, people found ways to resist in other ways too, through art, music, literature, even just like little acts of defiance every day.
Yeah, yeah. It shows that even when things are really bleak, hope can still, it can still find a way. And those small acts of resistance, they can add up.
Absolutely. We often think like, well, what can I do? But history shows us that even the smallest actions, courage, compassion, they matter.
So I guess like as we're wrapping up this deep dive, what are some of the like biggest takeaways? Like what should our listeners really remember about the Berlin Wall?
I think the biggest one is just that change is possible, even when it seems, impossible. That wall stood for, almost 30 years, the symbol of division, oppression,
Yeah.
and then bam, in a matter of days, it's gone.
It's like a reminder to never give up hope.
Yeah, exactly.
With
But it's
people.
not just hope, right? It's action. Those people, they didn't just hope for change. They made it happen. They organized, they protested, they put themselves on the line. It's a call to action for all of us.
We've talked a lot about the fall of the wall, like as this victory for freedom, but what about the darker side? I mean, it represents a pretty scary time too. Division, fear, violence.
Right, and we can't forget about that. We have to acknowledge the pain, the suffering, families that were torn apart, lives that were lost, all those years of living with constant surveillance, those scars, they run deep.
Remembering that bleak the story is, I think, it's really important
Yeah.
to understand, the full impact.
It is. Studying history, it's not just about celebrating the good stuff. It's also about looking at the bad stuff, learning from the mistakes, so we can move forward.
So we've talked a lot about the physical Berlin Wall, but what about those other walls? The ones that still exist, the metaphorical ones. Prejudice, inequality, fear. What can we learn from those who brought down the Berlin Wall, and how can we use those lessons for today's problems?
That's the question, right? That we all need to think about. The Berlin Wall shows us that even the toughest barriers, well, they can be broken. But the fight for freedom and justice, well, it never really ends.
It's about seeing those walls, right?
Yeah.
The ones in our own lives, and then having the guts to challenge them.
Yeah. Speaking out against injustice, sticking up for those who need help. It's about building a better world together.
And remembering that even the small things, they can make a difference.
Absolutely. The Berlin Wall coming down, yeah, that was huge. But it was really the result of, tons of individual actions. Every person who stood up, who fought back, they all played a role.
So, to wrap up this deep dive, I think, let's leave our listeners with this. What walls do you see?
Yeah.
And what are you going to do about them?
Yeah. Think about that. The divisions, the problems, and then remember what we've learned today, the power of people, of hope, of never giving up. The Berlin Wall is more than just history. It's a reminder that we can make a difference. If we work together, we can build a better future.